Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and you're very, very welcome to ISAC Ireland Chapter's second webinar in our webinar series. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Valerie Lyons of BH Consulting. Valerie is the Chief Operations Officer with BH Consulting and has previously worked with KBC Bank as their Head of Information Risk. So she has a wealth of knowledge in this whole area of privacy. She has made it a specialism of hers over the last number of years. And in fact, she's undertaking a PhD in privacy at the moment and has in fact carried out some very, very interesting research. And we're really looking forward to Valerie's presentation now in a moment or two. This webinar will run for about an hour. We should have about 40 minutes for the presentation itself, and there will be room for questions at the end. If you have any questions about any of the material that we cover today, just put it in the chat. You should see a chat button at the bottom of the screen. I'll be keeping an eye on the questions that people are popping in, as will my colleague Paul Hare, who is the Vice President of ISAC Ireland Chapter. And thanks, Paul, for joining in on that role. And we'll keep an eye on the questions, and we will then give your questions to Valerie at the end. So I'm really, really delighted with this presentation. Valerie has spoken at some of our events before, and I have to say the feedback has always been very, very positive. We really enjoy Valerie's insight. She has a great breadth of perception around the whole area of privacy, all its various angles. So really looking forward to this. So without further ado, Valerie, I'll hand it over to you. Take it away. Thanks a million.
Thank you, Fergal, for that introduction. Thank you very much for the invite to speak at this webinar. I suppose I'll just give everybody a quick background, really, to what I'm going to be talking about and to who I am. Fergal has given you a pretty good idea of who I am. I'm the Chief Operations Officer for BH Consulting. That's for the last 4.5 years. And prior to that, I was Head of Information Risk Management in KBC Bank for about 15 years. So all told, I've been in cybersecurity for about 25 years of my career, and the last 7 I've spent in privacy. So I'm one of their senior privacy consultants in BH as well. For the last 4 years, for those of you who know me, you would well know that I've been doing a PhD in privacy and will likely be finished that in probably 2036, 2040 at this rate. It's so long. I'm trying to understand in my research why organizations behave in particular ways, why they undertake certain privacy decisions, and I'm trying to understand that beyond regulation. Okay, so it's easy to understand regulation, but it's not so easy to understand what they do beyond regulation. So beyond regulation, we call this the non-market environment. And part of the non-market environment is privacy as a corporate social responsibility. So it's one of the things I'm looking at. And I wrote an article some time ago on LinkedIn during the COVID crisis. We're still in it, but during the beginning of it. And it was in response to some of the things I saw on LinkedIn about COVID and about the different things that were happening during the pandemic. And the article essentially was what I've been asked to talk about. Today is a presentation of that same article. So my research into privacy as a corporate social responsibility sort of started me to question, do we have a responsibility to behave in the same way we ask organizations to behave? So that's essentially what this presentation is about. And we have lots of time apparently for questions at the end. So let's get on with this. First of all, I'm going to just put some caveats out there. This is a philosophical conversation. There's no rights, there's no wrongs. There isn't a yes, there isn't a no, there isn't even a gray area. Everybody has a philosophical belief a moral code that they follow, and what's right for them is right for them. So I'm only asking everybody to think and talk about the different things that I'm bringing up here, but I don't have the answers, and I don't claim to have the answers, because the answers come from within each of us. We all have to make our own decisions. So I'm not making comment on anybody's decisions, and nor should anybody else be doing that. But I'm just, it's a philosophical discussion, really. Another thing I have to note is that I know that our audience is mixed, okay? So we have an audience, some of our audience are from the EU, some of them are from the US. So when we have a mixed audience like that, we need to just talk about the word privacy and the word data protection, because they're quite confusing. So I just want to get some things out of the way on privacy and data protection. Data protection means the protection of individuals with regard to the collection, use, and other processing of personal data. Privacy is much bigger, and both are dealt with under different pieces of legislation. But in the US, they use privacy to cover both. And so now the term has become synonymous, that we use privacy to describe data protection, when in fact it's not data protection, or it's not privacy, it's actually data protection, but we use it synonymously. And even Data Protection Day has become Data Privacy Day. So for the purpose of this presentation, when we refer to privacy, we're talking about data protection and privacy. So just so we address that up front. Okay. So the reason I started this article on LinkedIn, which trended and created a lot of discussion, was I noticed that one of the things the WHO was saying to us was, in order to lift lockdown safely, we had to do three things. We had to do extensive testing, of which I know nothing about. They had to do speedy contact tracing and exposure notification, which we're going to talk about. And they had to isolate those who were infected. They were the three things. And the first and the third, I certainly cannot make comment on, because I'm not in the medical sphere. But the second piece is the one that started my philosophical juices flowing, shall we say. And so the challenge with contact tracing and exposure notification is you have to answer a question. The question you have to answer is, in the last 2 weeks, who have you been in contact with for more than 10 minutes within a 2-meter space? So who were you in contact with on that bus, on that train, in that queue, at that shopping center? We actually don't know their names. And that is a huge problem, is that when I can say, well, Auntie Mary and Uncle Bill, I know who they can contact, but the problem is I don't know beyond that. So that's really, really difficult for any health sector organization, any public health body to be able to deal with. So for effective and speedy contact tracing and for exposure notification, we, as in those who are suffering from COVID in this case, may have to notify a piece of our health information to a public health authority. And they may be using an app. And if they are you going to use the app? And this ultimately is the question. Are you going to use the app? And so the conversation started, and it started really on LinkedIn, about, are you going to use the app? And we saw Google and Apple connecting and collaborating together in partnership to create something that was going to be the beneficiary for any of these apps. And we started to call it the Apple and Google app. So they didn't create an app. In fact, what they created was an API, or in fact it was called a UPI, a unified programmable interface. Okay, it was something that was going to connect iOS with Android. That's essentially what they were going to do, so that all phones could connect. Okay, and public health authorities then could use that API to create their own apps. And that's what was created at the time. So Google and Apple created this API that apps could use. So the public health authorities in each individual location could use or create their own app and then use the API, which meant that your data, or that piece of data, could be shared all over the world if you traveled, so that every other health organization could in fact use your COVID status so that we'd all be using the same API. I thought it was a cracking idea. That was just me personally. I thought it was a really good idea. It collected very little information in terms of the API. What health bodies did with it subsequently was very different. But at the time, this is what was being talked about. So I noticed at the time, sorry, moving too quickly. I noticed at the time, there was a lot of legal people telling us what was legally allowed and what wasn't legally allowed, what consent would allow us to do, what consent wouldn't allow us to do. And the law will always be able to tell us those things. What it won't be able to tell us is what about what's right, because what's right may involve ethics. And excuse me, the law often falls down on ethics. So I noticed that an awful lot of privacy advocates were saying, you know, over my dead body. And there was no, it's very easy to say no to something, but it's not necessarily so easy to say no to something and proffer really robust arguments as to why, and also to proffer alternatives. That's a far more difficult task to achieve. So I asked in my article that if you are going to say no and proffer a no and promote no, then can you propose a concrete alternative that will address how we can easily trace individuals who we've been in contact with, and can identify those who breach perhaps the rules that we have and put other people, other vulnerable people at risk? And can you provide a solution or a proposed solution that can provide people with the confidence that they need to know that somebody isn't a risk to them? So that was my question to them. And then I also ask, in the event that such an alternative isn't available, or that people cannot trade their privacy or do not want to trade their privacy, are they going to continue to operate in the world that is post-pandemic? So that when the rest of us return to the world, and those of us who have this app in place and we're able to identify who's a risk and who's not a risk, in that case, what are those people who've said no going to do? And it's a bit like I was reminded about, and again, I'm not voicing any opinion, but there is the argument about vaccinations and anti-vaccinations, okay, so MMRs and the 5-in-1, the 3-in-1, that the anti-vaccinators, they claim that there is very little disease in the community, and that there is no need to take these vaccines now as a result of there being little disease in the community. And the pro-vaccinators say the only reason that there's little disease in the community is because they're taking the risk and they're actually vaccinating. And so in that case, the vaccinators claim that the anti-vaxxers are acting immorally because they are gaining, they're the beneficiaries of something they don't take a risk for. Now, whether you agree, but we're not even going to talk about vaccines, but I just saw an analogy between the two that said, you know, if you're going to say no, but you're going to go back out into the world and you're going to be a risk when you go back out into the world, is it right to do that? So you just need to think about that question. So, also, when we say no to the trading of our privacy, which is essentially what we're going to be doing, is to trade our privacy. When we say no, we're already trading enormous quantities of it. And so if you're saying no, are you saying no to everything? Are you saying no to trading your privacy for the loyalty cards? Are you saying no in your smart devices at home? Are you saying no when you do a Google search? Are you saying no when you use social media apps? Are you saying no when you use your Fitbit and your activity trackers? You're not. All these things most of us use, and as privacy advocates, our best job is to tell people how to use them safely. So when we talk about privacy, and this is, I suppose, where my research starts to move in. When we talk about privacy, privacy is not an absolute, and so we shouldn't talk about privacy like it's an absolute. Privacy is, first of all, a human right, but it's not an absolute human right. When you go to the airport, you lose your rights to privacy. you get patted down. You know what happens if you don't agree to being patted down. You get your bag searched. Your information is sent to airports all around the world, an advanced passenger list. So your privacy as a human right is invaded at an airport. Data protection. So your privacy in data protection is also not absolute. So your right to be deleted under GDPR is not an absolute right. It has to be balanced with the public interest. So there is no absolute right to privacy when people talk about it, but there is, of course, a right to privacy dealt with in Ireland through the Constitution, and then we have data protection rights dealt with through GDPR in the EU. But privacy is primarily a commodity. It's a property. It's something we trade. We trade it every day. And it's this privacy and the trading of privacy that essentially is what my article is about. Is it our responsibility to trade privacy sometimes when it's for the greater good? So when we trade privacy, when we look to give something about ourselves, we do a cost-benefit analysis, and this cost-benefit analysis is actually called the privacy calculus. We make a calculation based on what are the benefits and what are the costs to our privacy. Now, it might sound simple, like, put in a formula and Bob's your uncle, there you go, but it's not so simple. And the reason is we're human beings. And as human beings, things get very, very complicated. So what affects these dimensions of privacy calculus? So many. And I'm just going to give you a kind of a quick glimpse across the things that affect our privacy calculus. First of all, really interesting is our socioeconomic background and our education. You might think that everybody behaves the same about their privacy, but they actually don't. So we know from studies that the lower socioeconomic backgrounds and the lower education backgrounds have higher privacy concerns and higher privacy risks. And we know that in 2019, this particular article, a study was done in 2015. So it was only published in 2019, but in 2015, Mary Madden undertook this study, really interesting study with 30,000 US citizens on data privacy, and 48% of the lowest income groups said they were very concerned about privacy, where only 24% of the highest earners were concerned, okay? So we also know that when they have to trade privacy, so socioeconomically, when someone, for instance, is renting a home or going to a housing council, they have to sing like a canary about their personal details. But when you go to get a mortgage, not as much information is demanded from you. So there's an unfair disparity between the amounts of information that are asked from lower socioeconomic poverty areas than in the more wealthy. So that creates concerns, and we behave about those concerns, okay? So we trade our privacy less as a result. Age is another factor, and a very important one. For instance, we know that the under 25s, okay, so those sort of up until 25 years of age, they'll sell their privacy soul to look cool, for sociability. That's what they will sell their souls for. Whereas the over 40s, they're going to sell their souls for a 10% discount and a loyalty card. Okay, so we know that we behave differently with age. Gender is another piece. We know that men are more private about their home space and women more private about their workspace. Very interesting one is culture. Okay, so culturally, for instance, if you think about the Great Firewall of China, the Chinese have very little expectation of privacy. So compared to ourselves, they have a very subdued relationship with privacy. And more interestingly, the word privacy, when translated from the Chinese word, translates to shame, which tells you that they don't consider privacy something that they demand or have an expectation of in the same way that we do. A really interesting study on how we create that calculus, and one of those other factors that inputs into that calculus is our political leniency. So our political leanings. So this one is interesting. It's that a study on surveillance found that the Republicans tend to feel pleased and comfort about tracking both online and real life, whereas Democrats feel discomfort. So we see that our political leanings will have an impact also. And then the law, okay, and it's, laws in different places. We see what happens at the airport when we realize that pieces of legislation say we have to compromise our privacy. So we accept certain laws tell us that we have to compromise our privacy. GDPR, for instance, in the EU will change how we have expectations for our privacy. Okay. So then we have also got these things called intrinsic motivations. These are factors that are intrinsic. There are personality types rather than all those other extrinsic factors that we've talked about. There are personality types. So we have those people and we all know them, but they're going to take a risk. And those people are likely to be bigger risk takers with their privacy than, say, somebody who isn't a high risk taker. And we also have those people who are private. We've often seen, we'd say, oh, they're a very private person. So they have a disposition towards privacy or propensity towards privacy. They too will not trade their privacy as easily as others. And finally, we've context, okay? So when I'm with my GP, I'll most likely sing like a canary, okay? I'm not going to hold anything back. So I'm going to trade privacy quite easily in that context, but maybe not so across the counter in Tesco's. So that's just a quick window view of what privacy might look like when we go to do a trade of our privacy, okay? The one big thing about them is that we are the beneficiary, okay? For each of those things, when we trade our privacy, we are the beneficiary. We are the ones who gain from that privacy. So when I go and I get the loyalty discount, I gain. When I go and I get the sociability or the cool, I gain. That's my gain. So I am the beneficiary. And my question is, do we have a social responsibility to trade our privacy for the greater good? Okay, it's utilitarian. And does privacy reign supreme? Okay, if not. So in order to look at privacy as a personal social responsibility, let's take a look at what we expect organizations to do as a corporate social responsibility. I'm going to quickly go through this now. What does organizations have? We have an expectation that they adhere to the law. And beyond that, we expect them to be corporate citizens. And that means that they recognize the responsibilities that they have towards society. And those responsibilities have evolved over time. And these are the responsibilities that I'm looking at, which are identified by a guy called Weston in his paper in 2009, a pivotal paper. Societal, which is corporate social responsibility. Political, which is corporate political activity, and governments moving into sort of social political involvement there. So just quickly going through it, this is a picture of the most famous corporate social responsibility pillars. Okay, it's quite old, back to 1979, but Carroll, Archie Carroll, is the father of this particular diagram called the pillars, the pyramid of corporate social responsibility pillars. Bottom of it is an organization must be profitable. On top of that, they must obey the law. And on top of that, they must do what's right. They must be ethical. And then they must be a good corporate citizen. Okay, it's pretty simple, straightforward. Privacy fits into that because Mintzberg in 1983, so this was in 79, in 83, Mintzberg came along and said CSR comes into play when existing legislation needs compliance with the spirit and the letter of the law, and where corporations can fool customers and their supply chain through its superior knowledge. So privacy fits into that definition. But then Carroll also went on to say in 91 that privacy can also be categorized as an ethical and philanthropic responsibility as law is insufficient to govern corporate decision-making in all areas of data handling. So that's corporate social responsibility in the quickest nutshell. That is the 30-second whistle-stop tour of privacy as a corporate social responsibility. You might think that corporate social responsibility is something that makes you feel warm and fuzzy about organizations, or you may see it as being something that organizations do because they've been so bad for years, and now they just want to say they found Jesus. So whatever side you take on CSR, I take the latter. I'm a bit of a cynic on CSR. It doesn't really matter, they do it. That's the most important thing, is they do it. Not the motivation for why, but the fact is they do it. And what I'm asking, should we be doing our own version, which is the pyramid of personal social responsibilities? We all have a responsibility to make sure that we pay our debts and that we keep ourselves financially in the correct figures. We have to obey the law. We have to be ethical and morally right and do the right thing. And we also have to be good corporate citizens. So what about how we behave towards privacy? So what are our ethical responsibilities towards society regarding privacy? Can we ask of organizations what we don't demand of ourselves? And so should we share information? If we go beyond COVID, should we share information for the greater good, even though we know it's an invasion of our privacy? In other words, we're not the beneficiary of the trade. The rest of society is. Okay? So, do we have a moral obligation to trade our privacy for making the workplace safe, for instance? To avoid or manage terrorism? And I ask these questions: avoiding infection, reducing workload on frontline workers, and avoiding a global depression. These are things that, do we have a moral obligation to trade our privacy for? I'm not asking these in the future, I'm asking these in the past, because we've done this in the past. When did we do this before? We've been here before. We did this after 9/11. We traded our privacy willingly after 9/11 in order to do all those things that I've just pointed out there. So what would happen at an airport if we didn't trade our privacy? Well, first of all, because legislation came in then afterwards, first of all, we wouldn't get on our holidays. It's as simple as that. We wouldn't be able to go to places. And what would happen to society then is the question we need to ask next. And we could have terrorism attacks just like this if we didn't allow our privacy to be invaded. So I then ask, well, what's our role as privacy professionals? Our role is not to say no. That's not what our role is, just not over my dead body. I believe our role as privacy professionals is to look at things, first of all, philosophically, and then to be, so we have now a situation where the data controllers creating these APIs, these data controllers are sucking out information and have the potential to oversee our behaviors, such as our location, etc. And we need to be the watchers of the watchers. So we need to be the big brother to big brother. And that's one of our key roles is accountability and making sure that those data controllers are kept to account. We also need to guide and shape the limitation of information use so that we can provide assurances to those willing to trade their privacy for the greater good. How do we do that? Well, we can advocate for the use of privacy enhancing technologies, for instance, such as differential privacy, which I know Google use and Apple use, and the use of blockchain. So how much do we know about those, and do we need to learn more about them, because these apps are going to be using those. We need to be vigilant to the misuse or extended use of citizens' data. We need to monitor and hold to account those tasked with the provision of such services. And typically they're public health bodies who are going to be tasked with the provision of these services. So we have FOIs that we can make. We have subject access requests that we can make, okay? Demanding access to DPIAs, for instance, because they are public bodies, we are able to make those demands. And to take a look at that API framework. If we don't know what that API framework is, we need to really be clear about exactly what is collected by that API framework. And then privacy by design. Okay, so we need privacy hygiene, we need privacy by design for how those apps are developed. And then we need to ensure that the trading of our privacy, has a timeline, that we don't We don't allow this to go on forever. When you think about how long the information is being collected at airports for, and that was 9/11, it's still happening today, nothing has changed. We really need to make sure that when citizens' information is collected, that there is a retention period and that citizens can't exercise their right to be deleted. So the possible future of the pandemic, well, let's think back to the future without all those restrictions that we have at airports. You know, the future was bleak without all those restrictions at airports. So what's the possible future of the pandemic? Well, in the article, I posited that perhaps in the future, big gatherings like this can only be attended for those who can confirm their health status in some way. Perhaps going to theatre can only be done if you can confirm your health status in some way. And perhaps going out to restaurants, the same. Who knows? I don't know. I just know that these are philosophical questions that we all need to think about, and we all need to be conscious in terms of what we as privacy professionals advocate others do, because they will come to us and ask us to provide guidelines, to shape and to help what those guidelines look like. That's pretty much it. This is our team, and I'd like to just thank you very much for having me speak to you today. And if you have any questions, we've got plenty of question time.
Thank you very, very much, Valerie. That was absolutely excellent and very, very informative. You have some very, very thought-provoking ideas there, and certainly we'll ponder them for some time. It's an area that we all really need to engage with, not just those of us who are working in the area of information security or data privacy, but all members of society. We need to take our digital selves very seriously and consider all the angles. I just see one question here from Peter in relation to multinational organizations, that are we expecting too much of multinational organizations who have to operate in various legislative environments and also various societal environments? What should they do to ensure that they have a consistent approach across the board?
Well, I can tell you, if we look at the large ones who are doing right, so if we look to IBM and Cisco, for instance, they're operating at GDPR across the board. So GDPR being the peak of data protection, it's easier rather. Now, they do two things in their CSR correspondence, so in their publications, they will claim that because they respect data rights so much and that they respect your rights to privacy, that they're implementing GDPR across the board. But it's much easier to implement one piece of legislation across the board that will meet everyone's requirements than it is to do a patchwork. So they can just say we're GDPR across the board. That means that we know that we might be a little bit higher in some places than we need to be, but that's okay, as long as we know we're not lower. And at the moment, GDPR is the highest. So right across the board, those organizations are implementing GDPR. So Microsoft, IBM, Cisco, I'm sure there's a few others, they're just ones I can name off the top of my head. But that's the best way to do it, is to actually just pick the top level and to apply across the board at the top level to say we're GDPR across the board.
Yes, but isn't that making the assumption then that the GDPR is the most societally acceptable approach across the world?
Well, it's not the, that's not what's going to drive why an organization will do it. You know, whatever an organization may say, what it will do is it will do the one that's the easiest, most straightforward one. And that one is going to be do GDPR across the board. Societally fair, as in the piece of legislation that gives data subjects the most rights, is GDPR. So it is the most difficult for organizations to do across the board, but it means they don't have a patchwork to deal with. And it's that patchwork that can be really, really complicated from a governance perspective. Whereas if you know it's GDPR across the board, everybody knows what the goal is. But in terms of what empowers the data subject the most, it's most definitely GDPR. You could look at other pieces of legislation and say like CCPA, but CCPA only applies to consumers. It doesn't apply to data subjects, whereas GDPR applies to everybody, not just consumers. It applies to patients, it applies to students, it applies to employees. So it's not just to consumers. But there's one piece in CCPA, which would be the do not use my information, do not sell my information button. And I think that would be a lovely one to have in GDPR.
That's great. Thanks, Valerie. I have another interesting one here from Charles, who asks, or rather says, research suggests people value security, in brackets safety, over privacy when evaluating trading, and also demand that the state provide it.
So when you're talking about security there, what you're talking about is security as in national security as opposed to cyber security. So it's a word that's a very confusing word. So when we talk about it's national security versus privacy, is it okay to compromise your privacy? So it isn't straightforward. There's many studies done. We feel, so there's the reason that we feel okay about privacy being traded for national security in the airport, we'll say, is that we get a collective sense from it. In other words, when you're walking through, Fergal, and I'm looking at you and you're being patted down, I get comfort from your being patted down that now I'm safe because I know you're being patted down. So there's a collective comfort from seeing you being patted down. So it's not just about me. I'm actually looking around me at the airport and I'm taking comfort. So when it comes to trading, I'm trading based on your trading, and I know that I'm getting comfort from your trading. So I'm just trading to get that comfort, because if I say no, you might say no, and then I won't get that comfort. So it's coming back to me. But on national security versus privacy, there's lots of different studies. And so to say privacy, it's too big a thing to say. So when you say national security, do people believe that it's okay to, for instance, PRISM, to go into back doors and accept backdoor invasion on the basis of national security? No, they don't. Studies have said they didn't agree with PRISM at all. Do they agree with breaking into the encryption keys of the mobile phones of terrorists? Well, in 2015 and 2016, Apple said no. But Pew did research in 2016, and the American nation of smartphone users, so they did a huge piece of research at the time, was split. 53% were against Apple and the rest were pro Apple's decision. So it's a very divisive issue. Privacy is a very divisive issue when it comes to national security versus privacy. But you do have to be specific as to what piece of privacy and what piece of national security. So surveillance at government level. For instance, we have also Peter Grenwald, who did a great TED talk, 2012, 2013, I think, based on the Edward Snowden incidents, and because he was Edward Snowden's publisher, he published an awful lot of, he was a journalist at the time. He said that those people, many, many people say it's okay to compromise your privacy. It's I have nothing to hide. I have nothing to hide. And sure, the FBI was saying, well, only bad people need to worry. And then, so, you know, people who are lay people, and this is back to us as a profession, people who are lay people accept that and they go, oh yeah, well, I mean, it doesn't really affect me. I mean, they can look at my email, sure, what are they going to see in my email? But who are bad people? And Peter Grenwald talks about this in his TED talk. What about journalists? Are they bad people? Maybe they're journalists who are talking about stuff that the government doesn't want them to talk about. So maybe suddenly they're bad people, and now the FBI is looking at them. Activists, are they bad people? You know, you suddenly realize that the word bad people, you went straight to terrorism, but maybe it's got a bigger cohort of people in there. So we need to be really, really careful about accepting compromise of our privacy at national level. That said, it happens all the time. If we believe in Ireland that our government isn't invading our privacy on a regular basis, then you need to take a look at the publications that made 16,000 last year. It happens all the time.
Thanks, Valerie. I have one here from John who asks, to what extent do you think the state can extend interpretation of vital interests, in other words, legal basis, to commandeer data from Google and do the privacy trading for you during pandemic situations? So the state commandeering data from Google to do the privacy trading.
Making the assumption that Google have the data. So the API that exists is literally an interface between Google and between Apple that allows you, they're not collecting the health data. What they're doing is they're collecting the bouncing information, if you want to call it that. That's what they're collecting, is the bouncing information. When your app says, I am COVID positive, it looks to all those bounces. And if it finds that a bounce was in 2 meters of you for a period of 10 minutes or more, or whatever the law says in a particular country, then it notifies them through the app. So I don't know how Apple and Google can be commandeered by any public body. I don't see how that would happen. I don't see how it could legally happen. And I certainly don't see it happening under vital interest. It doesn't, I know that, for instance, all the apps have to be done under consent, unless you're in Korea.
Thanks a million, Valerie. Martin has a very interesting question. First of all, he says, thank you, Valerie. What about those in society who, for whatever reason, are not able to consent for themselves? What sort of society would decide on the trading of their privacy based on the premise that we need a high level of adoption to enable the benefits to society?
So you're either talking, it's not specific there, about either children or about vulnerable adults. So both are special category under GDPR, for instance. So as with all of those, it has to be done through Guardian. There's no other way. It has to be done through Guardian if they're going to be included. But a lot of those vulnerable adults may in fact be cocooning anyway. So you want to protect them from connecting with it in the first place, as opposed to being involved in contact tracing afterwards. And children, I mean, I really don't know how they're going to deal with children. I actually don't know. Maybe it can't be 100%. I know that contact tracing and this concept of the exposure notification apps and contact tracing apps, they're only to support the manual process that's there in place. They're not supposed to be a tool by themselves. So I don't know how you could ever achieve 100%.
Okay, that's great, Valerie. Thank you very much. They were very, very interesting questions. We also have a few thank yous and good wishes, including one from an ISAC colleague in Hyderabad in India, Amrita. So thank you, Amrita, for those kind wishes, and I will pass them on to Valerie. Also from Andy. Thank you, Andy, who asks, will the slides be available? And yes, we will be making them available on the ISACA website for ISACA members. So Valerie, thank you very, very much for participating in the webinar with us this afternoon. I think you've given us an awful lot of thought for the future and certainly for the duration of this pandemic. And I hope it won't be too long, but I expect it's going to last for a while until we get a vaccination.
I think you could be right.
I'm afraid. Thank you everybody for tuning in. We were delighted to have you with us this afternoon, and we look forward to bringing you another webinar in this series in the not too distant future. Okay, thank you everybody, and that's it for today.
See you guys.